Okay. Ahoy, I heard. I thought only sailors said ahoy until I heard that you guys are all sailors. And okay, it's a real pleasure to be in Brno. Thank you to Jan and Marketa for inviting me. Jan and Marketa I know from the time that I was teaching in this other city nearby called Vienna. And I think that was actually the place where for the first time I started thinking about the relevance of urban riots for architecture, or vice versa. But that is not the first thing I wanted to talk about. Actually, I just wanted to show you very simply the results of two researches and two exhibitions that my office has been involved in over the past couple of months. To start with the last one, as Jan already told you, the Banality of Good. The Banality of Good was an exhibition that we made for the Biennale of Venice, the last one, called Common Ground. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's still up. It's, I think, until late November. And this was an exhibition on one of the things that our office, this is what the exhibition looks like. This is what a Venice exhibition looks like. These people look as if they're actually looking at the exhibition, but they're not. They are actually looking for where the next cocktail party is. And there, like every other room, there are free drinks and champagne, etc. So that is what these people are actually looking at. And what we do as architects there is just background decoration. The exhibition about the banality of this is without the audience. This exhibition was on New Towns. New Towns has always been, or the past 5 years has been a big obsession for the Office of Crimson in many senses, because as you may know, Crimson is an office of architectural historians. I was also not raised or educated as an architect, but as a historian. But as a historian and with our office, we have always also been involved in the practice. So we have not just written history books, we have also tried to make urban plans, etc. And now more and more we are also involved in the political side of it, trying to develop new policies, trying to influence politics, etc. Now this exhibition on the banality of good, it was, you might think, where does this name come from, the banality of good? And some of you who have studied philosophy or have looked into that might think this rings a bell. Yes, it does. It reminds you of a very famous term invented by the philosopher Hannah Arendt. She talked of the banality of evil. Why did she talk about the banality of evil? She used this term when she wrote her famous book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. She went to the trial of Eichmann, the war criminal, Second World War criminal, in Jerusalem, the trial that eventually convicted him to be hanged. And she realized there that Eichmann was just a civil servant, that Eichmann was just a bureaucrat, somebody working for the government, and that Eichmann, she realized that during the trial, was completely surprised and really shocked that he was convicted of anything, that he was being called a bad man, that he was being called a criminal for having been complicit in the murder of millions of people. Why was he so shocked? He said, well, I was merely doing my job. I was merely making sure that the technology and the organization and the management of the Holocaust, in this case, was done at the most professional, most efficient manner. And since to actually do the Holocaust was a political choice, I have nothing to do with politics, I have nothing to do with ideology, I just do my job, and I did it in the best way possible. And so what what Hannah Arendt thought was that there was something completely banal about this type of evil. It is an evil that is not romantic, or it is not an evil that seeks to conquer the world or to cause as much pain as possible. It is evil because it is so banal. It is evil because it is so empty and because it is so purely trusting the ideology that is at stake there. Now, much later, the British historian Tony Judt, fantastic historian, you should all read his book Post War. His surname is spelled Judt. He recently died. He wrote in his very last book, he had a chapter called The Banality of Good. And since Tony Judt is also a Jewish historian and very much interested in the Second World War, that was a conscious reminder of Hannah Arendt's first use of the term banality of evil. And what he basically said was that in the post-war period, there was this immense state apparatus, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, by the way, a state apparatus that was so professional and so huge and so technocratic that it could actually be used for many purposes. During the Second World War, it could be used for a really evil purpose, like the extermination of Jews, but after that period, this enormous state apparatus of bureaucracy, technology, infrastructure planning, engineering, architecture, planning, etc., all this could also be turned to use something else. And he called this the banality of good, because in the post-war period, this ideology of planning, of engineering, of technocracy was used to build out the welfare state, to build, and probably in Czechoslovakia then it was called something else than the welfare state, but basically on both sides of the Iron Curtain there was a near consensus that the apparatus of state could be used to build out a gigantic societal machine that could consist of public schools, that could consist of cultural institutions, of healthcare, of insurances, social benefits for people. So it could be. So there's an idea of the banality of evil and the banality of good that are equal in the sense that they are both different ideological infills of what is in fact one structural engineering system. Now, why did we use this very long, complicated introduction? Because the idea of new towns is exactly that. The idea of new towns, we think that the planning of new towns is on the one hand one of the most visible and most clear symbols of the state planning an entire society, and on the other hand it is also a very clear example of how a technology can be separated from its ideology and used within completely different contexts, and that's what I'd like to show to you. Now this enormous people, as I told you, people who visit the Biennale of Venice don't actually read things or take a close look at things. They just wander through these halls and they get impressions of what they see, you hope. And so many people thought that this, and you might be excused at this point to also think that this is an exhibition about religion, because we have these triptychs here, and we have this strange spiritual New Age looking object in the middle, and also there was a slight draft in these halls in the central pavilion, and so all these things turned a little bit like wind chimes, and making these beautiful little noises. But in fact, it is a diagram, and in fact, it is the diagram, the most influential diagram of planning and architecture, town planning and architecture in the 20th century. And as we would like to put to you, it still is extremely important for us now. It is more or less the reduction or the abstraction of all the town planning diagrams of the 20th century, of course, beginning with the famous Ebenezer Howard diagram that was made around 1900 in England. And the amazing thing of this was the diagram used by Ebenezer Howard to explain the whole idea of the garden city. Now this whole idea of the garden city, you could say, was the big bang of town planning of the 20th century. Because what it actually did, and it doesn't really matter precisely how, but what it did was it kind of decomposes or deconstructs the city as this gigantic, complicated, historical, layered, partly unplanned, partly planned thing. It deconstructs it into a very simple formula. It and a formula that does not just describe the physical makeup of the city, but also its societal makeup, its economic makeup, everything, its infrastructure, logistics, etc. What Ebenezer Howard did around 1900 was say a city, an ideal city, to be a city that is social and fair and etc. to everyone, has to be built up first of the family. You have the family lives in a neighborhood, the neighborhood lives in a part of town, many parts of towns make one town. If you put these towns all together, you have a gigantic urban region. This one will always be like 20 to 30,000 people. One part of it, a neighborhood, would be 5,000 people, etc. The whole thing could be 250,000 people. Now, this extreme reduction of what consists of a city, it was a typical engineering way of thinking, typical engineering thought, typical bureaucratic, technocratic banality kind of good, in this sense, kind of thought. That it says, because everything can be explained with this diagram, the way that people relate to their neighbors, the way that people find their way to the central city, the fact that people have some things that they do on a daily basis, some things they do on a weekly basis, some things they do on a monthly basis, and this corresponds to different scales. Everything can be explained here, which is why this diagram became so incredibly influential. It became also very influential, talk about this switch back to evil. One of the most important geographers of the 20th century was Walter Kristaller. Walter Kristaller was a German geographer, and he developed his central places theory somewhere in the 1930s in southern Germany, at the same university where Heidegger actually taught, also in the same period. And this central places theory, he said that ideally an entire region consists of 6 small villages around one larger villages, 6 larger villages around one provincial town, 6 provincial towns around one major town. And in that way you can explain the entire region. And then there's a very simple step that you can go from explaining an entire region to planning an entire region. So when Heinrich Himmler asked for advice from planners and architects in that university in southern Germany for how, once we have exterminated all Jews and Slavs, etc., from the eastern parts of Europe, and we want to replan it as Lebensraum for a new German continent, how can we do that? And then Walter Kristaller was brought in, and he developed, for example, the kind of geographic basis for the planning of the eastern areas of the Reich, all the way to including Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. So here, what is also funny about Walter Kristaller is that Walter Kristaller is still being used. Walter Kristaller, just after the war, he moved to America, and there he founded an extremely influential form of geography, because he could combine economic and geographical features in one model. And Kristaller's models, because they are also mathematical models, are still to this day being used by planners and regional planners when they want to know where can we put a large shopping center, where can we put a large regional functions, and how do they relate to the local functions, etc. So here Walter Kristaller is an excellent example of this idea that technology can be separated from its ideological roots and even switch from the banality of evil to the banality of good and back again, etc. He is, in that sense, comparable to the rocket scientists who made the bombs, the rocket bombs for the Nazis, Werner von Braun, and then got shipped to the United States and developed the space program for John F. Kennedy. So architecture and planning has this side of pure technology that can be shipped from one ideology and one continent to the other. Now, another long introduction. What we actually try to do with our exhibition, to bring it straight back to the new towns, in our exhibition we don't actually talk about these huge issues of Walter Kristaller and Nazis, etc. What we did is we focus on 6 new towns that have been planned over the past 6 decades. And in each of these new towns we show that actually this model of Howard, this hierarchical formula-like model of town planning, how it was used in the beginning and how it is being used now. Now, immediately after the war in England, there was the first wave of new town planning. The first Labour government after the war, who created things like the National Health Service, etc., who built out this gigantic welfare state machine that the current British government is now taking apart again. One of their major things was building a system of new towns throughout England. And one of the first new towns they built was that of Stevenage, just outside of London. Now the new town of Stevenage, what we tried to do in the front of these 6 triptychs that we made in Venice was to show, okay, which values, which ideologies were injected into this model in this specific case, and for who were these injected, and how were they interpreted, with which types of urban planning knowledge, which types of extra diagrams, etc. Now, so in Stevenage, you had to do with the fact that there was the dark, smoggy, industrial and also partly bombed out London that people wanted to get away from. But at the same time, people, the working classes and the middle classes of London, wanted to get away from that awful dark overcrowded London. But at the same time, what was extremely important in that time in England was the idea of community. The idea of togetherness, of solidarity. This was an atmosphere in London that had to do with 5 years of being bombed during the war. And so there was a strong emphasis, especially from the Social Democrat government, and also from that of community life, of good homes, that also the worker would have a right to a kind of something that before then seemed to be only attainable for Americans, the suburb or rich people, the suburban house, the greenery, etc. So these values of a home, a community, and welfare, they were all injected into this new town of Stevenage. And to do that, so you have people like Louis Silkin, a very famous English politician, a social democrat politician, who had all these ideas. He was basically the main politician behind the New Town movement. And then, of course, within that you had all these great English planning heroes like Patrick Abercrombie and Ebenezer Howard, the man with the moustache and his diagram. So these things together shaped Stevenage. But at the same time, the plan of Stevenage, which is basically just a kind of a reconversion of this same ideologically neutral plan that I showed you before, and then reconvert it so that it fits this specific landscape, this specific program. And what we did on the back side of the triptychs was this. I used to study art history, and one of the interesting things that you learn, and you know it probably too if you look at medieval or Baroque art in churches, that on the back side of the panels of a triptych, on the front side you have the story, the main story, and on the back side sometimes you have what they call grisaille, and this means in grey. So in grey colors you would have, or in no colors but in grey, you would have, for example, on the negative side of the story, you would have the bad consequences, you would have the world of people who have not acknowledged Christ or what have you. And so what we did on the back side of our triptychs, while on the front side we had the ideals, the values, the dreams, the original ideologies. On the back side we merely put photographs that we took ourselves in these areas. Just the daily reality, with no real judgment, just how is it there? Does home and community and welfare, does it really jump out of the image at you? I don't think so. So this is just the daily reality. So this is another layer of this story that we try to show, that on the one hand these new towns, they are enormous ambitions of idealism and political imagery and narratives, etc. But at the same time, these are just towns, just places where normal people go about their lives from day to day, and hour to hour, and decade to decade, and they bring up their children there, and they marry, they divorce, they are happy, unhappy, etc. So these places also are banal. So this is the kind of the other meaning of banality, the plain reality of places, even if they are planned as gigantically ambitious dreams. Another town we discovered and uncovered is the town of Tema, T-E-M-A, in Ghana. Now, Tema, we found it important to also involve cities from Africa, because especially in the early 60s and the late 50s, early 60s, you had this enormous wave of countries in Africa becoming independent and the decolonization. And this, of course, meant that these countries had to invent themselves. These new nation states had to invent themselves. So here there was an enormous hunger for ideology, for images, for political ambitions, for political narratives, and also, of course, at the same time, an enormous need for infrastructure, planning, investments. There were enormous amounts of money being either pumped into these countries from America, from the West, and sometimes in the same country at the same time from the East, because each of the power blocks wanted to get these decolonizing third world countries on their side. So Ghana was typically a town that took a lot of money from the West, from America, and used that money, and not just the money, but also knowledge, to build out gigantic infrastructure projects, dams and electricity factories and new harbors, etc. And one of the big things that they did in Ghana was build the new harbor town of Tema. And for this they used the planner Konstantinos Doxiadis. He's a Greek planner, but he was one of the major planners of this American inspired and American paid investments in decolonizing countries. Doxiadis also planned, for example, Baghdad after the war. He planned the new capital of Pakistan, Islamabad. He planned gigantic cities in Libya, so all in the Middle East and Asia and Africa. He always, in those countries that were kind of nearly on the western side, he made gigantic plans for them. And he also built this city in Ghana. Now, the idea in Ghana was that the people there could move from a kind of a rural-based economy to an economy of manufacturing, highly and a kind of modern, Western-inspired, but still African modern economy. So the values injected here were those of industry, progress, and of course independence. And the main players in it were Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and of course Doxiadis with his crazy technocratic systems approach to urban planning. And here you see the kind of the scheme. Again, you see, and it's all the time a repeat, but then within a different kind of context and informed by different interpretations. The same idea that cities consist of neighborhoods within parts of town, within town, etc. And the reality of it is an interesting hybrid of modernist planned and modernist designed hardware, and then a kind of more temporary use that over the years makes the place more African. So you have this interesting, so the houses and the architecture, they are, you could say, universal models that were then exported all over the world, notwithstanding the context. But then you can see the context has this way of creeping up and taking over anyway. So, but what with these two, I'm going to go to the third example. The third example is a Dutch town. We even once made an exhibition about this place, actually that was called Dutch Town. But this is the new town of Almere, a typical 70s, so we go from the 50s, 60s, 70s. A typical 70s example of new town planning. This new town was actually for people, the working classes and the middle classes of Amsterdam, who did not accept anymore the kind of small and bad housing conditions in central Amsterdam, but who also did not want to live in these gigantic Siedlungen that were built outside of the city. They also aspired to this suburban lifestyle. And so the new town of Almere was built outside of Amsterdam, in the polder, in completely new land, far away from the city. Not just a new town, but new land. That's what we in Holland used to do. And this city was interesting because here there was one specific element that needed to be addressed, and that is that you cannot move Amsterdam people to the suburbs. Because there all the ideas of community and the urban kind of coziness would be they would not have them. So in Almere, the values injected into the town were, on the one hand, an individualist suburban lifestyle, consumerist, but on the other hand, still an idea of being Amsterdammers, and that is an extremely strong theme for people from there. So in the new town that was built, it needed to be, and there's a mysterious Dutch word that some of you might be familiar with. It's called gezellig. The only word that comes close to it is in the German language, which would be gemütlich. And the only word that comes close to that would be cozy, but then cozy is something else, really. Gezelligheid means that it has to do with your it's slightly chauvinist, it has to do with family, but it also has to do with surroundings, and it has to do with nostalgia, etc. So what they did is the planners, they made a kind of postmodern reinterpretation of the Amsterdam canal houses and canals in the centers of Almere. Now, so it's an interesting. What is interesting about that is that this was not done out of commercial reasoning. It was really considered by these public planners. Here you have them. One of them, he died recently, the great Dirk Vrieling. He used to be a colleague of mine in Delft. They really took this concept of gemütlichkeit or gezelligheid as a very serious and socially relevant concept to plan a city with, to make these people feel at home. This is the, as you can see, what you can also see, there's a kind of an evolution in the, if you start with the original plan, they sort of getting looser and looser, larger, etc. There's a kind of drifting apart of these things. Here you have what we did in the exhibition is we made small steel and then laser cut models of these diagrams, and then put them on the aerial pictures. This is Almere, how it looks right now. Actually, Almere is very gezellig if you're sensitive to that kind of thing. Now, so the first three ones are, whatever their outcome might be, whatever the backside of these things might show to you, whatever the reality that came out of them, they were all three attempts by government, by the state, by the public sector, to provide cities, towns, houses for the collective, for in principle everyone. They were all about the ideas that these planners and these politicians had about how their society, their nation should develop in the future. They were all injected with ideologies of the collective. Gezelligheid for everyone. Industry for everyone. Homes for everyone. Now, the next three I'm going to show you, with the first of the next three as a possible hybrid, are different. They show something else. And they show something that is exactly the same. This is the new town of Songjiang, near Shanghai, it was planned already 10, 50 years ago, and it's still being built up. It's a city of 2 million inhabitants, so it's a smallish new town in Chinese terms. And here, what you can see here is this city is not aimed at providing homes for everyone. It is aimed at providing homes for one specific group, albeit a group that consists of hundreds of millions of people, but still it is one specific group, meaning that it is also aimed at not allowing another group. This is a new town aimed at the rising affluent middle classes of China, because the affluent middle classes of China find it difficult to find homes in the existing cities, so you have to build new cities for them. So what you can see is something that you could confuse the enormous presence of these gigantic Siedlung-like concentrations of apartments that basically define the city as being okay. So this is just like welfare state or even socialist planning. It is and it is not, because there's a specific group that this is planned for, and also the town is, so it's middle class. That is, so here you can see a very specific class-based ideology being injected into this model. The other one is middle-class mass housing, and the second thing is unique attraction. Now, this kind of clumsy expression comes from the planning documents and from the political policies behind it. That this town should consist of zones that all of them have a unique attraction, and this unique attraction could be a university, but it means that the center of town would be Dutch, or it would be Italian, or it would be French, or it would be Renaissance, so there are unique attractions. These planners they go around the world and they recognize that what makes Prague a unique town is that you have this unique attraction, the history of it. That's unique. You cannot reproduce that. We would say, yes, you can reproduce that. So it is a kind of artificial injection of something that we think is unreproducible. It's an artificial injection of authenticity. So this town is unique all over. So this is a beautiful kind of contradiction that is typical for Chinese planning at this moment. So that is Songjiang, and so this is the more machine-like diagram of Songjiang. So unique attraction, unique attraction, unique attraction, unique attraction, really big unique attraction, etc. And then 2 million people, and this is what it looks like. Here you have part of the unique attraction. I mean, we can laugh about it, but then I visited the Tugendhat house today, and I heard that it's a very popular, also as a site for wedding parties. So, you know, it's just a different type of architecture, but that's all. That's all. I'm sure that there will be a Chinese new town of 2 million people that has as a unique attraction all the modernist masterpieces of the 20s and 30s, and then combined into one new city center. So this is the interesting thing of this is that how artificial and how planned and how determined it is. The current Songjiang, these are pictures we took there. It also very fast develops into a Chinese city, like all Chinese cities. So there's a kind of a strength and an intensity of the urban life still there that kind of makes these cities. The funny thing is, this is an injection of authenticity that creates something completely inauthentic, and this is an absence of any ambition for authenticity that makes it extremely authentic. So that's a more difficult contradiction. Now the fifth town I want to show is more scary even. It's a city in Saudi Arabia. It's called King Abdullah Economic City, and this city goes much further in doing in being a city for the elite. This is a city for extremely wealthy Saudi families and for expats, and thereby the city has to perform a very difficult trick in its ideologies that are invested. Because on the one hand you have economy. The city is there to attract economy to Saudi Arabia. How does it do that? To create spaces where the reality of Saudi Arabia, or the reality of guest workers and local habits and all kinds of people, etc., have to be completely excised. They have to be completely denied, pushed away, and neutralized, and so that you can make islands, oases, you could say, to use an Arabian term, where you would have absolutely nothing to do with your context. You would absolutely nothing to do with the reality of the place that you are in, and thereby you would attract those people who bring so much money with them and who would invest so much that you can get your economy going. So in order to get your economy going, you have to create places that are completely antiseptic to everything that goes on around them. But the difficult trick is you have two types of people who can do that. On the one hand, the Saudi families themselves, very, very rich, very powerful, but also officially extremely devout, extremely Islamic, extremely Muslim. So this means that all kinds of things, the Muslim values, all the things that you cannot do, etc. On the other hand, you want to attract expats. The Canadian internet billionaires, German engineers, etc. You want to attract them with their families, meaning that these people want because nobody wants to move to Saudi Arabia, so you have to offer these people all the luxury in the world, everything. You have to offer them golf courses and shopping malls and constant and everything that they might want to have. And of course, these two ideologies are very difficult to combine with each other. And this creates very strange, very difficult to understand urban plans. But on the other hand, the economic city itself, here it is, King Abdullah himself looking at the plan. But in the way the planning itself it's a purely financially defined business. This is it's being built right now. When the consultants who are designing this, KPF from America is one of the big consultants, Cohn Pedersen Fox, one of the largest architecture offices. When they heard that we were researching this and wanted to show it at the Venice Biennale, we felt honored. They sent us emails from their head offices in Chicago threatening us with lawyers, with a lawsuit, because we were exposing their plans, and they said that is theft of intellectual property, industrial espionage, etc. But then everything that we took, we just took out of commercial magazines. So that was different. So we took our risk. But then sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with nightmares of American lawyers. This is the town as it is right now. It looks as if an atom bomb has already gone off, but it's probably one of the scariest places on Earth. Now, this research was embedded actually in a broader, slightly more technical, slightly more boring research, in which we took a sample, because we have a database, we have been studying these towns for ages now, and we have a database of hundreds of these towns, and we took about 50 of them out, and we subjected all 50 of them, including the 6 ones that we actually showed. We subjected them to a kind of a comparative research in all kinds of things, and out of that, because of course if you take just six, you can tell whatever story you want. But out of this kind of more systematic research, a number of things came. So these are all what we call the passports of all these cities, with a number of things about who paid for them, who were they built for, how large are they, which architects were involved, and if they were involved, what were they actually doing, etc. So, and I'd like to take you through a number of these conclusions. Now, one of the so we ordered them chronologically, as you can see, and there's 3 or 4 headlines that we took out of this research and that we also presented in Venice. Now, one of them goes from that, and these headlines are we made them very loud and very like caricature, like sound bites, like you do with headlines. One of the headlines that we found is that new town planning has gone from its origins to now, from the 50s to now, went from housing the poor to sheltering the rich. Now, how do you determine that as a kind of a structural movement? If you look at the first year, so this is like 40s and 50s new towns, and you look at the whole program of them, and you look at the types of houses, etc., you put that all together, and you can see that we have 3 columns, the lower class, middle class, and upper class. You can see that they were a very important part was the lower class. That was an important reason also actually to stop, especially in the West, in the Social Democrat West, one of the main reasons, and also in the decolonizing countries, one of the main reasons to invest so much in social housing with American money was because if you don't provide social housing, these people might turn to communism. So it was especially they weren't so afraid of the Dutch turning to communism, but the Greeks, for example, or African countries. So that even for the West, they nearly needed to make their own type of communism in order to stop the people turning to communism. I'm not saying that they would have done that, but that was one of the biggest paranoid fears of Western planners and politicians then. So what you can see is that in the 40s and 50s, some towns also provided for upper classes, but that was very rare. Because of course these the upper classes prefer to live in the larger cities, but some towns had such a high engineering class, etc., that they also needed to do that. But for the rest, it was very heavily represented in the left and the middle column. And then if you go to the 90s and 2000s, the most recent and then there's the part in the middle that it kind of starts moving, you can see that there's hardly any new town ever being planned again for social housing. Social housing is never, in the recent generation, never social housing. It's middle class and upper class. So there's really a very important shift. Now the second one is who is actually building these things, and with whose money, and where from. And we say that it goes from public works. So new towns were first planned from the same kind of philosophy, the same kind of policy makers as the health services and education, and now it's gone to global finance. And this means two things. It goes from public to private, but that is not even the most important thing. It also goes from national or even local and regional to global. And that is really important, because if it goes to global, there's nothing that you or anyone can do about it anymore. There's no democratic legitimization, there's no control about it anymore. So that is an important move. And as you can see in the 50s, 60s, late 40s even, you can see that most of it is this is local, and this is kind of local, national, and this is global. So in the beginning there was hardly any global input, and most of it, you can see there's public to private, that goes from blue to red, and then there's from left to right, it goes from local to global. So there is, the colors are not clear, there is a certain amount of private money sometimes, like large building companies investing in the 50s already. But it is mostly local and national, mostly national projects. And then if you go down, you can see that it becomes a huge hybrid. It's all over, money comes from all over the place. Sometimes it's local, then it's national, and there's an enormous amount of red money on the right. And red money on the right means global finance. And that means, for example, and I'll show you an example later of what that might mean. That could be not just global investment, so just global money, but it could also mean global knowledge. So it could mean consultancies, large engineering firms like the one that I just told you about, KPF, who I cannot control what KPF is doing in Chicago, but somehow KPF in Chicago is very aware of what I am doing in Venice, scarily enough. So that is happening right now. And very little, so there's an enormous soup of sources of money. And then the last one, this one is a little bit difficult to explain, but very relevant to you all. It's about the role of the architects in the planning of new towns, and also the position of the architect in the planning of new towns, and also what he or she brings. And this, and the role of design. And here we call it goes from the common good to the postcard image. And here we really touch the heart of this question of the banality of good. And I'll try to explain it to you. This one is the source of this is difficult to explain. You have a thing called the Avery Index of architectural publications, and this is a gigantic database that has been maintained since the 50s, first by hand with little cards, and now it's a huge, now it's an immense internet database, and it compiles everything that is published about architecture. So not about building, not about construction, but only about construction in terms of architecture, design, planning, architecture. So all architectural publications of the entire world are compiled into the Avery Index, and you can look it up on public housing, casinos, toilets, Mies van der Rohe, Brno, etc. You can search for everything. Now, what we did is first we looked for new towns. So this is all new. This is all the new towns in the Avery Index, and then we looked at what is, if the new town is represented in publications in 1950, you look at all the publications about architects in new towns, what do you find, how many of those are about the master plan? Because if the master plan is mentioned in an architectural publication about new towns, that means that the architects are involved in the making of the master plan, etc. We did the same for industry, for public facilities, for cultural facilities, for for commercial facilities, and for social housing. And then if you look at the top, so at the 1950s, you see an interesting thing. You see a lot of architects were involved in the master plan. So Doxiadis, he could say, I designed the master plan for Tema. That's what I did. So they owned it. They wanted to publish about it, because this is not so much about the objective knowledge about were they involved, but it is about their own choice to talk about it, to publish about it, to engage in a discourse, in a dialogue with the rest of their profession. So it is about what they are proud of, because this is what they choose to publish in the architectural publications. So they are very proud of being involved in the master plan. They are also very proud of sometimes building new factories, etc., industry. They're quite proud of building schools, hospitals, etc., the public facilities. There was hardly any time or any money or any idea to build cultural facilities like museums or operas, etc. That was not what these new towns were about. There was a little bit of shopping design and a very large amount, a respectable amount of social housing at the very beginning. And then if you go to the very end, you see this interesting shift. You see that the master plan is very small, has become much, much smaller. So architects, they might be involved, like KPF, but also like KPF is maybe involved in the master plan, but if I want to talk about KPF being involved in the master plan, they send their lawyers. So they're not really willing to engage in discourse about that. They are hardly, they do hardly anything with industry, etc. Now the most interesting thing is this. Social public facilities have shrunk. Cultural facilities are huge. This is, I think, public facilities, and this is housing nearly nothing. Now, what does that mean? That means, to put it very bluntly, that architects, if they are involved in new towns, they might brag a bit that they have something to do with the master plan, but what they are mostly proud of is that they design things like this. This is a shape. Forget about it. It's they are most proud of building the new Guggenheim Louvre BMW Center for the King Abdullah Economic City number 12. That's what they are proud of. They are proud of being brought in at the end and doing a silly trick with a shape, and then leaving by jet plane to the next new town. So architects do not take pride, or do not even have a position in, you could say, building the bones or the real basis of new towns, if that basis even exists. They take pride in using the new town, because a new town means a gigantic investment of money, and using some of that money to build an icon. Now, this is another, a little detail, because this graph that I just showed you, it just tells you the proportion to the total of Newtown publications. But this talks about the total of Newtown publications of publications in the Avery Index about new towns. So it goes up and then it goes down very fast. And that means that in total a lot less, but really a lot less is being published about new towns in the current age in architecture by architects on new towns than it was in the 50s and 60s. And you would say, well, maybe that's because there are being less new towns built. But the opposite is true, because these little figures here, they represent the total number of people in millions that are settling in new towns per decade. So there's an enormous increase in the amount of people affected by the design and planning of new towns, and at the same time there's an enormous retreat in the interest and the engagement of architects in that, or their willingness in talking about that. And that, so I think this little diagram is actually the most dramatic, because it shows because architects are now all, I mean, the fashionable thing for architects to do right now is to say, I'm not interested in making large master plans or iconic buildings anymore. I am interested in working in slums. Slums, the one places that show that you don't need architects. And still, that always holds a kind of sadomasochistic fascination for architects, clearly. And I want to do temporary things and urban farming and pop-up stores, etc. So the interest. And that is very strange, because if you look at this part of reality, you can see that there's one place where hundreds of millions of people are being affected in how they live, in their living conditions, etc., by planning and design. Because these new towns are all planned and designed. They're just not planned and designed by you. And if they are planned and designed by you, because by some accident you might end up working for a gigantic engineering consultancy based somewhere in cyberspace between Munich and Jakarta and Chicago, you will not be allowed to talk about what you are doing. So in a way you could say, if there is a kind of territory that architects should win back, it is this territory that they are already potentially so deeply involved in, meaning the planning of new towns. Because it is not so that there is less urban planning in the world going on than there was. There is more urban planning going on right now. And it is not so that there are less planning, less design, less determination by designers or planners of how people live going on than there used to be. That is a myth. It is not so that in the 50s and 60s our environment was more planned than it is right now. That's an absolute myth. It is just so that architects are suffering from a kind of self-denial in how they want to deal with that. So that but not everyone is so much in self-denial about that. There's one town that the most scary new town I think in the world, and if only because it's the prototype for a new generation of new towns that could be in the hundreds. It's the so-called smart cities, and one of them is the new Songjiang. It's a gigantic new town in Korea, and this new town is one of the main investors and main engineering firms powering it, and I mean that literally and figuratively, is Cisco Systems. So Cisco Systems is now one of the major, and this town, New Songdo, is the first one. There are already 300,000 or 400,000 people living there. This is how it looks. It looks like everything in the world. New Songdo is the first one, and they want to build 400 of these towns. New Songdo will have 2 million people. And why does Cisco Systems, you know Cisco Systems, they make routers, basically. And they make internet cables, data cables. Why does Cisco System want to do this? Why are they investing all this money in hundreds of new towns of this size around the world? They do so because they say we want to create a new standard of new town life that is so dependent on the internet that we will thereby sell 100 times more routers, and we sell 100 times more internet cables. And this is we invited these people to a conference, and it's literally so that they say, because they have, for example, an apartment product. That's how they call it. So you would buy an apartment in one of these towers, and the entire apartment would be manageable using your iPhone from your work. So you would say, okay, I have to go to the shop. So you look on your smartphone, and then the smartphone tells you what you have in your fridge and what you don't. You can cook through your iPhone. All these things that you know that you one day you will not be able to live without. One of the most scary examples was you can see on your smartphone, once you are either at home or in the office, if your Filipino maid, who always brings your child to school, if the child has actually passed the school gates. So your whole life, so you can see, you can check, because you don't have time to bring your child to the school yourself. You can check everything. So it is the Cisco Systems is now developing a lifestyle based on pure comfort and pure ease of use. It's a kind of Steve Jobs meets Le Corbusier, and so. But these things are. There's an enormous amount of design intelligence going on here. There's an enormous amount of power. There are gigantic amounts of money, and they are basically using the same basic technology of new town planning that was once upon a time invented by architects, used for many decades, from ideas of the common good, etc., ideals of how to shape society, and is now being used by completely different parties for completely different goals. And the interesting thing about that is that the most important switch that has been made is that what once was made as models for the collective is now anti-collective, because all of these towns are attractive by reason of the fact that you can live like that, because you do not want to live like the others live. The reason that the fact that the Filipino maid has to be controlled even when she brings your child to the school is because you are so afraid of the world outside you. You do not want the world outside to touch you, etc. So new town planning has, I'm not saying that it has now become the banality of evil, that would be overstating it, but you can see that this same technology has now been taken over by another ideology. This is the part of the lecture that I wanted to do in 20 minutes. It says here 1 hour, 1 minute and 54 seconds. So I'll try to do the last part that I wanted to do in 45 minutes. That would mean I'll try to do it in half an hour. 20 minutes. Okay. The other. And it's very confusing for me because I decided to combine two things that I have not combined before. Usually I either talk about the Newtown story and I say it's such a shame that architects don't take master planning, etc. more seriously, and it's such a shame that they don't do that anymore. And then I have this other lecture in which I talk about the effects of architects doing master planning and how incredibly disastrous that is, and etc. So, and this is the first time that I'm combining these two lectures. So what you at least learn about is my total schizophrenia and deep ambiguity about what architects should do. Now this, but seriously, this exhibition we made a little bit earlier, in completely different circumstances, even if it was also a biennale, but then it's the pathetically small and badly organized Biennale of Rotterdam. And within that we made an exhibition, and this exhibition, it was called Design as Politics, and actually this exhibition I made with my chair in Delft. It's the first time we, as a chair, we came out with a show, and this exhibition is about some meaningless image. This exhibition has a kind of a subtitle. It's called "Damn the Master Plan." So while the first part of the lecture is "Hooray for the Master Plan," the second part is "Damn the Master Plan." Now, "Damn the Master Plan" is not a quote by a philosopher or Hannah Arendt or a British Jewish historian. It's a quote, if you could call it that, by the Black Panthers. And you might know who the Black Panthers were. They were the militant side of the black consciousness movement in the 50s and 60s. After Martin Luther King was killed, after Malcolm X was murdered, etc., they realized that the whole idea of peaceful peaceful resistance and peaceful integration and peaceful convincing of the system in America might not work, and that the Black Panthers, they said, you know, we've tried that. They've shot our prophets. They've killed our leaders. We are not going to take it anymore. We are not going to do this anymore. And why is that important? And then there was and why I find this important is what I want to talk about here is if sometimes architects make plans, make enormous schemes that are filled with good intentions for the public good, for the commons. For really, really emancipatory, progressive ideas about reshaping society to make it better. And still, sometimes, they are just not trusted. They are just not, people don't believe it. People just don't believe what you or we are doing. Even if we completely, we are Jesus-like in our goodness, they just don't trust us. And I find that an underestimated part of our world, our profession. Now, back to the Black Panthers. When in 1969, a group of the region of New York presented the plan for New York, the plan for New York City, which was really, if you look, they're beautiful. These books that are this big, beautiful, beautiful plans, really progressive planning from the 60s, amazingly well researched, very aware of the huge inequalities in New York, very aware of the need for new public facilities, public transport, healthcare, schools, etc., making this fantastic plan. And the master plan for New York City was then presented to a large audience of planners in the ballroom of the Hilton Hotel in New York City. So everybody was convinced, now this is the time of Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, etc. Everybody was convinced that they were doing the right thing, overcoming decades of racial prejudice, etc. In the back of the room, there was a group of Black Panthers, like these guys, that were shouting, "Damn the master's plan." Because it doesn't say "damn the master plan," it says "damn the master's plan." And why? And there's a very subtle and very, at the same time, very brutal reference in this. The master plan, we see that as a technical term. When a group of militant black men say the master's plan, they say something else. Damn the new plan made by the masters. And the masters holds a very specific meaning, especially coming from black men in the United States. It's the slave master. There you have him again, the slave master. There you have him again. First he wants us to pick cotton, then he sends us to the factories, now he wants us, etc. First then he wants to kill us, then he wants to ship us to from Africa to etc. So there's this, by calling the master plan the master's plan, it opens up this Pandora's box of centuries of abuse, of course, centuries of repression, and also centuries of oppression cannot be solved by years or even decades of good-intentioned planning. And so this idea of damn the master's plan, that is why we called it like, is to me a very painful but very eloquent a demonstration of this enormous gap, this enormous canyon that you can have between the good intentions of the planner and, on the other hand, the reality, and not a reality that is physical or statistical or etc. It's a reality of identity, a reality of memory, a reality of stories, how people are telling stories to each other, a reality of two entirely different interpretations of history, being on one side of history or on the other. It's a canyon of language also. We say master plan, they say master's plan. So, and it is this canyon, this reality, that architects who are technocrats or are from a technocratic family, and I literally count myself to belong to that family of architects. Even I've been so long within this, I've been an undercover cop so long in this world that I've now taken, I'm indistinguishable of the people that I'm supposed to research. We come from a background of thinking in diagrams and thinking of formulas and thinking of solutions, thinking of clever solutions to difficult problems. And so so we have an enormous problem with understanding or accepting things that we discover that we think are not fair. I think it's not fair. What these guys are saying, it's not fair. This is not a master's plan. We were really thinking about you. So there's this kind of, that's the disconnect of architects with their audience that happens a lot of times. Now, what we try, this research had, here you have in the end, the Black Panthers even came forward, stood on this, there was this table like this standing in the Hilton with all these planners sitting there, and they stood on the table and they, with megaphones, and they completely took over the meeting, which is kind of a wonderful thing. Now, this research actually, and this exhibition was about this. This was the real core of that exhibition. This enormous distrust, the fact that master planning can lead to enormous outbursts of aggression, and thereby illustrate very different interpretations of. And one of the first things that one of the reasons that we did that is we started researching, for example, the riots in Detroit in 1967. I'll skip through the riots. We also actually try to understand very spatially how these riots actually evolved. But one of the things that I wanted, actually what happened is, riots always start in the same way. They start with a very, you could say, banal incident of often police brutality against a certain minority, but then an incidence of police brutality that happens nearly every week. And then this one time, it sparks a riot that takes over the whole city. And exactly the same thing happened in Detroit. And it led to half the city being burned down. And the interesting thing, what I want to show you here, that's what I'm going to focus on just for a few minutes, is why are riots interesting for architects and historians like myself? They are interesting because they reveal something. They reveal this canyon. Just like this shouting of damn the master's plan, they reveal the fact that the planners and the politicians might have an extremely optimistic idea of what they are doing at a certain point, and then something like these riots or another type of mini riot happens, and then we are forced to acknowledge, oh my God, the situation is not like we thought it was. And that's why Detroit is so interesting for one specific thing to me. It's that when the riots in Detroit happened, there were enormous researches, oh my God, how could this have happened, etc. And these researches revealed that the city was deeply, deeply, deeply segregated. That the blacks and the whites hardly even talked, they didn't talk to each other. They had no, there was they went to completely different schools. The schools of the blacks were awfully bad, and the schools of the whites were really good, etc. There was a deep frustration, a deep segregation that was nearly apartheid-like. And the funny thing is that people did not know. And also what it also revealed is that the people who actually still lived inside the city were nearly all the blacks, and the people who the politicians referred to most easily were the whites who lived on the edges of the city. So there was an enormous disconnect between the politicians, the plans, and the people who actually lived there. And that was revealed by the riots. Now, I think 2 months before the riots happened, and the riots did not just happen, they came out of years and years and years of a deteriorating situation. Months before the riot happened, the city of Detroit published or came out with this film called Detroit City on the Move. And it was seen as Detroit really presenting itself as the most modern, the most progressive, the most optimistic, and the most successful city in the United States. Why was it so optimistic and so successful? Because as the first city in the United States, because this was 3 years before the New York master plan, it had brought in master planning from Europe with Bauhaus-educated planners, etc., to America to really reinvent this city. And this movie was about that, and it was a movie that was played all over the United States. And it started out with Mayor Kavanaugh, Jerome Kavanaugh, the mayor of Detroit, and one of the big a Democrat, a big proponent of master planning. He showed the city that it was this wonderful modern city with modernist architecture. They had concert halls where they played European music, Wagner, Debussy, Beethoven, etc. They had a museum where you could look at... this is a woman in a fur coat and a hat looking at a Caravaggio-like painting. So you would have an art museum where you could enjoy the fruits of civilization of Europe, etc. And most importantly, so everything, there was this European reference, and you would have planners. Here's the plan. It looks like a madman. Planners cutting up the city, reconfiguring everything, making huge highways that would make the city accessible from all sides, etc. And also the good thing about building these highways is you could make a kind of a double trick. You could demolish all the slums where people live in conditions that people really should not have to live in. People should be having warm and cold water, and they should have good hygiene and electricity, etc. Should not live in shacks. So you could demolish all the shacks, put in the highways, and so all these things could be done to reshape. So these areas could be demolished. So which looks a little bit like this. So this could be built in its place. Mies van der Rohe. This is Lafayette Park. Lafayette Park is the most famous and the best, probably, urban project by Mies van the urban planning was done by Hilberseimer and the architecture by Mies van der Rohe. And it was done exactly in one of those demolished slum areas. And then this was put in place. And the architecture is by Mies van der Rohe. It's really, really, really beautiful. And so the interesting thing here is that, yes, this is really, really beautiful. I mean, my own school had an exhibition about this project made by Italians who talked about how beautiful it was, etc. But what is completely forgotten is this. Here you have the people that this project was made for, sitting in the revolving restaurant, looking at their wonderful new city, and this is what they at a certain point could see from that revolving restaurant. They could see that this whole part of the city, these people that had been moved out of their slums to these new high-rises on the edge of the city, these people, so that other people from the university could live in the Hilbersheimer and Mies van der Rohe designed paradise in the middle, that they were not so happy with all those projects that had been done. Even if all those projects, each and every one of them, could be explained in very progressive terms, there was a complete gap in understanding. So one of the things that was revealed by these riots was that the black community of Detroit felt that everything that the planners were doing, they were selling it like being good for them, but it meant that their most famous area called Black Bottom, which was this area that was demolished. They were demolishing the area where the blacks had their clubs and their bars and their restaurants, etc. They were being moved from the center of the city to the outskirts of the city. And then when they went back to where their neighborhood once was, they found this romantic modernist dream by Mies van der Rohe. So what you can see there is that this enormous, they did not trust the planners. Now, this is the French riots. I'm not. We don't have time. We also looked at those. Here you have Le Corbusier. You know him, huh? The idea of the French riots was, by planning this, was this the logical result? With this burnt car in the middle of the high-rises. What I want to talk to you about is something else. I'm skipping to the... So what we did is we researched all these riots. We researched the French riots. We researched the riots we researched the riots in London and Birmingham, etc. In the 1970s and 80s. We researched the riots in Los Angeles, the riots, and in the end we also researched the riots in London, the very recent ones. And all the time what you see is the same pattern happening. For example, the riots in London, and we represented that on it's not a triptych, but it's a kind of a precursor of it. It's made of cardboard. What you see in the London riots of last summer is that on the one hand you would have a city that was saying, we are going to have the Olympics, we are going to rebuild our city, regenerate, bring in all the stars of the world, etc. And by the Olympics we will make our city better again. We will overcome the problems of inequality and unemployment and youth crime, etc. And then they do that, and what it means is actually they need to demolish, regenerate and gentrify areas of East London and Brixton, and to bring in these enormous Olympic projects. And these people who at the same time they are saying, we are doing it also for you. This is the kind of graffiti that you could find in London everywhere in the running up to the Olympics. When the Olympics are a little bit closer, all of a sudden there was enormous amounts of money to clean all this up. It says "fuck the Olympics" for people in the back. And so the riots, when the riots of London were researched, it also turned out that you had exactly the same thing. You had a city of which the planners and the politicians had the feeling like we are going in the right direction. On the other hand, you had large parts of the population who said, that the city is doing nothing for us. They only want to kick us out. There's no respect for us. Nobody listens to us. If they say we are going to make a beautiful new public park for you, we don't trust them. That probably means that my house is going to be demolished. If they say no, your house is not going to be demolished, it probably means that my house will become so expensive that I can't live there anymore, etc. So there was a systemic distrust of everything that politicians and planners were doing for them, and that was one of the ingredients for the riots. Now, one of the... So here you see some image. So this is Brixton, one of the areas of South London, how it is right now. And at this time you already have things like this, protests against the gentrification, protests even against, if you as architects would say we are going to do a nice pop-up store here, you would probably get kicked out because they would say, because you are the first signs of gentrification. And you can also see that what you can see in places like London is that there's this enormous rise in inequality, so that at the same time house prices are going up very steeply, and on the other hand, on this bottom part, things are getting worse at a very fast rate. More homelessness. The middle classes are actually leaving the city, leaving a city that is now either lived in by people who are very poor or very rich, which leads to these things. Now I'm searching for, what we actually wanted to do. I'm searching for a certain image, as you can see. Let me talk about it, because you might be surprised. Why am I looking at Marvin Gaye here? One of the things that we discovered in our whole research of planning and how that affects a public distrust, etc., was the specific role of music. In America, for example, in this movement from, you had the early 60s, the Kennedy era, Martin Luther King, civil peaceful resistance, etc. You would have in the music, and of course the music industry in America, the black music industry, was based also in Detroit, which is why it is so important. It was called Motown, Motortown, that is Detroit. The auto industry and the music industry was nearly the same thing. In the early part of Motown, let's say until 67, 68, these music producers and singers and songwriters, they specifically aimed at turning the black music into something that the white people could also like. So the singers were dressed up extremely smoothly. They were shaved well. They looked not scary. They sang about love and nostalgia and heartbreak, etc. The greatest one was possibly Marvin Gaye. You can see another here. You can, for example, see the Supremes, Diana Ross, growing up in one of these high-rise estates built in the 40s and 50s in Detroit. And the closeness of this music industry and the car industry is illustrated by this blob. This is a clip from Martha and the Vandellas song "Dancing in the Street." And this song was actually, the clip was one of the first video clips. They sang the song on a car that was slowly being put together on the assembly line. So they were sitting on this car while so it's a complete combination of, we are the Motor City, optimistic, happy black people singing songs in Henry Ford's factories, etc. But what is also very interesting is that "Dancing in the Streets" was a #1 hit in the summer of '67 when the riots broke out. And "Dancing in the Streets," and this is another one of these linguistic canyons, "Dancing in the Streets" became a kind of slang, a kind of secret language for rioting. So "Dancing in the Streets" was this happy black rhythm and blues soul song. And at the same time, "Dancing in the Street" was the kind of hidden slogan for fighting the police, setting fire to police stations, etc. And what you can also see is that after the riots, 1968, 69, this is the same Marvin Gaye as you saw. Before he looked like a waiter in a restaurant, and now he looks like a drug dealer. And what happened is, at a certain point, the black music industry completely flipped. They said, and especially the artists themselves, they said, we are not going to act as if there are no problems anymore. We are not going to change the way that we look in order to make the white people feel comfortable with us. We are going to sing about our anger and our desperation, about our cities. We are going to sing about cities, and we are going to dress like we want to dress. And if the white people are afraid of us, we don't give a shit. This is a Marvin Gaye's first album from around 1970, What's Going On. So What's Going On is it's an album about, his most famous song on it is Inner City Blues, where he talks about the desperation and the kind of violence and poverty in the black inner cities. And this is the way that he looks. Another thing, what is also interesting there, in the same motor city, the same Detroit, is a song, a very, very sad, because this gives it's a song by John Lee Hooker. Here you have him, another typical blues musician who moved in the 30s already from the south of the United States to the north to find a job in the auto industry. When the riots broke out, he was already in his 50s, and he wrote this song, The Motor City is Burning. And this song describes how after years also of desperation and years of poverty, and that all of a sudden he saw his city around him burning, and people fighting each other, and everything, and the army coming in and shooting the citizens of Detroit. And so he sings about it in a very, very desperate and sad way. And he laments for his city. It's a real blues song. The Motor City is Burning. You can find it. I can't remember what the album is called, but I will soon. Later, after the riots, when the kind of hardcore hippie movement merged into a kind of a punk-like anarchy, with people like Iggy Pop and the Stooges and the MC5, these are names that some of you might be familiar with, all came from Detroit, and they started to record immediately after the riots also this song that had just come out by John Lee Hooker, The Motor City is Burning. While John Lee Hooker played it in a very sad and slow way and ended his song, I think the last lines are I have to get out of here. It's too hot. That's what John Lee Hooker said. The MC5 played that song with a completely different ending. They played I may be a white boy, but I can be bad too. I'd like to strike a match for freedom myself. Let it burn, let it burn, let it burn. So what is interesting about that is that you have a black community who, of course, is involved in the riots, but also see their own community being burned to the ground in total desperation. You have a kind of a white anarchist movement rising up, taking some of that, and then making it much more radical. But of course in a very problematic way, because you have these white kids who have turned themselves into Maoist, radical, hippie anarchists. They take they say, let it burn, let it burn, let it burn. So here you can see that the violence against the system nearly becomes programmatic. They say, we have to burn down the cities, we have to destroy everything. And this is a pattern that, interestingly enough, was repeated often, because, you know, when you talk about riots, especially if you talk about riots in London, which I did, you immediately get into a fight with one half. Whatever you say, you always get into a fight with one half of the audience. Because if I would say, these riots, it's really bad what these people did, setting fire to the shops in their neighborhood, then one half of the audience would say, how dare you say that, these people are oppressed, they are fighting for their freedom, etc. If I would say, these people are oppressed, they are fighting for this freedom, then the half of the audience would say, how dare you say that, they are destroying their own communities. And there is a deep ambiguity in talking about urban riots in that sense. There's a deep kind of contradiction. And one of the most, for me, most depressing elements of that were the riots in Los Angeles in 1992. Especially the role that hip-hop music played in that. Because on the one hand, this is a hip-hop studio with Snoop Dogg, when he was still very young, sitting there. And this is the famous album of NWA, Niggers with an Attitude, called Straight Outta Compton. Compton is one of the areas in the south central Los Angeles. Now, on the one hand, what this hip-hop music does, and that is why it is important, also for architects and planners, is that this hip-hop musicians once said, hip-hop is our CNN. It's the black CNN. Because it talks about the reality, not the white reality of the world, but our reality. And so on the one hand, you could say that if planners and politicians would have listened more to hip-hop in the 80s and 90s, then maybe the riots in 92 would not have come as such an enormous surprise to them. And that is true in a sense. But on the other hand, especially the hip-hop in the gangster rap in Los Angeles also had the kind of a really, really scary fascination with danger. And the thing that one of the things that I want to show you is this. Now, the way that this is the kind of nearly the architecture of drug dealing. During the riots of '92, the Crips and the Bloods, who were the two main gangs fighting for territory in Los Angeles, came together. They signed a truce, which they hadn't done for 20 years. And why did they? So all of a sudden, this is a map of Los Angeles according to where the Crips are and where the Bloods are. So if a boy carrying drugs would cross that line, he would get shot. They came together. Why did they come together? Because they wanted to unite in the fight against the police, and they wanted to unite in the fight in order to chase out all the Korean shop owners out of South Central. There were one of the things that came out of these riots was not only this reality, nobody wanted to talk about that before, but also the deep hatred from the black community against the Korean community, and the fact that the truce of the two gangs wanted to use the riots to chase out all the Koreans. And then even, and this is one of my favorite planning documents, this is after the riots were gone, the gangs still together said, we will rebuild the city. So the gangs of New York, or the gangs of Los Angeles, the Crips and the Bloods together, they proposed a whole series of measures how to rebuild the city and take the city back for the black community without any Asians or anyone involved. But they want to repave the roads, they want to make public parks, etc. So it's interesting that this movement that comes from really deeply violent drug wars, then all of a sudden, in this kind of chaos created by the riots, can take on this role of rebuilding the city. So here the hip-hop actually becomes architectural. Now the last thing that I want to show you, this is we don't have enough. This is actually the same thing as what happened in Detroit with first the black riots inspiring a white movement of punk was completely repeated actually in London and England in the 70s and 80s. This picture, it's one of the first albums of The Clash, the famous punk group of the 70s and 80s. The picture that they took was of the famous Notting Hill riots in 76, where the West Indian community rose up and fought against the police in the Notting Hill area, which was then a really bad area. Now it's been gentrified completely to death, with people like Julia Roberts living there, or making films about it, and probably now the members of the Clash live there. But they used this image of a street riot as their first album cover. Not only that, the Clash, as a group of 4 white art school guys, came together because during this riot they said, we want to riot too. So there were all these black guys rioting against the police, and they had these 4 art school students, and they said, we are going to do that too. And then there's a very interesting interview with a singer of the Clash. He says, we also wanted to set fire to a car. And they didn't know how to do that. So they felt complete, and then they said, okay, well, let's start a band then. And so they started one of England's first punk bands that always played against a backdrop of black urban violence. But much later, however, and that is why there's a kind of a farcical, funny side to that. On the other hand, there's when the Clash made their second album, they made a song called The Guns of Brixton. Now, The Guns of Brixton describes the area where one of the singers of the Clash lived. He was from Brixton. And he sings a song that goes something like, when they kick out your front door, how are you gonna come? With your hands on your head or on the trigger of your gun. And that's the famous first 4 lines of The Guns of Brixton. You should YouTube it, by the Clash. And what he describes then is a kind of feeling of extreme paranoia, a feeling of distrust from the people of Brixton against the police, and he literally describes that any moment now this is going to explode. And this song came out in 1980, and 4 months later the Brixton riots erupted in 1981. So it goes both ways, like whereas the planners and the politicians in Detroit could bring out a super optimistic plan for the city months before the riots came, the punk musicians of London could bring out songs about describing this eruption of violence also months before it actually happened. And of course there's no scientific theory, no scientific models with which you could actually maybe scan all songs that are coming out at a certain point and seeing is there something going to happen or not. But still there's a voice there. There's a voice in popular culture that is sometimes more, more eloquent in talking about the realities of the street and the realities of the city and how people look at the politicians, look at their city, than the kind of very schematic, technocratic methods that planners and politicians have. Now, the very last image I wanted to show you is therefore this. This is my favorite album ever, if only because of the cover. It's called Handsworth Revolution. Handsworth is a very problematic area in Birmingham, in North England. And what you see here, and Handsworth also had a huge riot some months after actually this album came out. And the album is made by Steel Pulse. Steel Pulse is a reggae group from Birmingham, and they're Jamaicans, and they're devout Rastafarians. Now, Rastafarian beliefs means it's a kind of a hybrid Christian, African Christian movement. The Rastafarians believe that, taking a kind of analogy with the Bible, that they are like the Israelites. They call themselves the Israelites, even if they're from Africa, who are banished to Babylon. And one day they will break the power of Babylon and move back to Zion. And Zion is the kind of ideal state. Babylon is us. It's Western, it's Europe. It's America, England, Europe. It's the white oppressors' world, where they are banished to. So they live in the areas of, they could live in Paris, they could live in New York, they could live in Birmingham. To them that is Babylon. And one day they will break the bonds and move back to Zion. And Zion would then mean a kind of a pure state of black nature, authenticity, etc. Now this cover of Steel Pulse, it takes, and in their case Zion would always be Jamaica, moving back to Jamaica. What this cover does is, it shows you cannot burnt out carcasses of cars, half demolished, burned down housing projects, demolished high streets, all the kind of typical decor of a post-riot environment. So there has been a riot. And of course this album came out in a period, 1980, where there had been riots every year. That always, they probably took this from newspaper clippings, that always left cities looking like this. And throughout this, but what you can also see is palm trees and black children wearing traditional black clothes standing there, and a mountain that is a famous mountain in Jamaica standing there, and you can see some traditional villages. So what you see coming here together is three things. There's the actual Jamaica that these people are coming from. There are dreams of African tribal and natural culture sitting there, and there's the reality of the English town post-riot. And so what you see here is that the riot here has, what this suggests is that the riot has kind of freed up. Babylon is destroyed, and on the ruins of Babylon, Zion is coming. And what that reminds you of course, is that when the students in Paris in 1968 started throwing stones at the police, they said "sous le pavé la plage," meaning underneath the cobblestones that they picked up and threw at the police, they found sand, the beach. So there's this nearly, if you would look at it in a kind of psychoanalytical way, you could see that there's also in rioting, there's a narrative, a mythology of rioting, where in rioting also means this kind of violent denial of the urban context in which we live. There might be some hidden frustrations, hidden fears, but also hidden nostalgias, hidden ideologies that talk about the search for emancipation, the search for authenticity, the search for pure nature even. Now I at this point, I'm still, people often ask me, why don't you've been talking about rights now for 5 years, when will you finally write the book? Because I keep promising that I'm going to write a book about it. And the reason that I can't write a book about it as yet, is that I still find it so complicated and so mysterious, all these stories together, that I don't know how to write it down. And with that, I'd like to leave you. Thank you very much.